Food SCPs. Chances are, if you've lived on this planet for some amount of time, you are aware of what food is, and if not, then this video is going to be especially confusing for you. That said, much like practically every other concept of reality, there are quite a few SCPs related to food, from the fantastical to the horrific. As usual, I will only be covering a handful of some of the more notable food anomalies, and of note, I won't be covering ones that I've already talked about in previous videos, such as the infinite pizza box, or ones that better fit in future videos, like the replicating cakes. Let's start with one of the most notable SCPs related to foodstuffs, SCP-294. 294 appears to be a standard coffee vending machine, but it possesses a keyboard for entering text on the front of it. After depositing 50 cents into the machine, the individual is prompted to enter in the name of any liquid using the touchpad. After doing so, a standard paper cup drops down and is subsequently filled with the liquid entered by the individual. The machine is capable of outputting practically any substance that can exist in a liquid form, from coffee and beer to sulfuric acid and liquid glass. Caustic liquids that would normally eat through a paper cup seem to have no effect on the cups dispensed by the machine. After approximately 50 uses, the machine will not respond to further requests for around 90 minutes, as it seems to restock itself. The machine was originally moved to a personnel break room as a money-saving venture, as it doesn't need to be stocked like a normal vending machine. But after a notable incident, guards were stationed at the item and a security clearance became necessary to interact with it. The incident occurred when Agent Joseph attempted to use the machine to obtain coffee during his allotted break time. At the request of another agent, just to see what it would do, Agent Joseph requested a cup of joe from the machine, a common expression for a cup of coffee. Moments after entering in the selection, however, Agent Joseph began to sweat profusely and complained of dizziness before collapsing. After being moved to the infirmary, the cup dispensed by the machine was discovered to contain a combination of blood, tissue, and other bodily fluids, with DNA testing revealing that the material matched that of Agent Joseph. He ended up making a complete recovery after 4 weeks, and both agents were reprimanded. Some further testing was done to test the machine's limits, such as requesting a cup of gold, which dispensed a cup of molten gold. A cup of anti-water was requested, but after humming briefly, the machine displayed out of range on its entry pad, suggesting that it has a limited range of collection and cannot reach into alternate universes or dimensions. Entering in a request for diamond also caused it to display out of range, as diamond is specifically a solid crystalline form of carbon. When cup of carbon was requested, the machine dispensed a cup of liquid carbon. A researcher under observation put in a request for the best drink he's ever had, resulting in the machine dispensing a fluid similar in appearance to cola. The researcher identified it as a mixed drink he recalled having at a bar during his bachelor party, which he was convinced was the best drink. He was not aware of the ingredients of the drink besides rum and cola, so it's unclear how the machine gathers its information. An agent then performed the same test, resulting in a beverage later identified as a Vienna lager. The cup was printed with a color picture of 5 men and 2 women drinking beer on the beach, with the agent being one of the individuals. The agent confirmed that his favorite drink was a Vienna lager that he had consumed at the beach with his friends. Another individual inputted the perfect drink as their request, resulting in an odorless lavender liquid. After drinking it, the subject appeared to go into shock, later committing suicide. They left a note behind which read, "I'm sorry, but at this point, everything's just one big letdown." None of the components of the drink have yet been identified. Another researcher tried a request for a cup of music, resulting in a clear, sparkling fluid that tasted vaguely alcoholic. After consuming it, the subject reported feeling a continuous rhythm and demonstrated the ability to move and even dance with a certain fluidity that he had not previously shown. During a mass security breach, an agent took shelter inside of the break room along with 3 other injured agents and requested a cup of pertinent medical knowledge. The machine poured a cup of clear green liquid, which resulted in the agent being able to mend the other agent's wounds in a manner consistent with Foundation medical training after consuming it. Afterwards, the agent no longer possessed the medical training, and other attempts to recreate the effect have failed. A doctor requested "My Life Story" from the machine, resulting in it humming and shaking violently for 3 minutes before providing a highly viscous, opaque black liquid. Upon consumption, the doctor reported that he remembered everything that had ever happened to him and managed to write a 538-page autobiography in the following 48 hours. A researcher input the phrase "surprise me," resulting in what appeared to be a cup containing normal water, but after being moved, it was revealed that the water had been heated to approximately 200 degrees Celsius. The water violently turned into steam, spraying boiling water in a 2-meter radius. Another researcher requested the blood of Christ, resulting in the machine displaying the message, "This is the cup of my blood," in Latin, and dispensing a small amount of red grape wine. Other requests for a cup of Smilodon blood, a cup of passenger pigeon blood, and a cup of Thomas Jefferson's blood all received out-of-range errors. A request for a cup of D151839's leukemia resulted in a cup of fluid that contained leukemic blast cells, which were a genetic match to the D class. A second request for a cup of the D class's leukemia resulted in an out-of-range error, and they were subsequently found to be free of leukemia. However, within 15 days, the leukemia had recurred. An oldie, but a goodie, and aside from some quirks, a pretty beneficial one. In a similar vein, but with even less predictability, is SCP-261, a vending machine with no front glass panel and a small keypad on its right side. It was originally recovered in Japan after the Foundation investigated an urban legend about a magic vending machine that was circulating on the internet. It was found in a back alley behind a large shopping center with a handwritten sign saying "out of order" in Japanese. Internally, the machine appears to be an ordinary vending machine, with no anomalous material found inside. It was determined that the machine has never actually contained any food or beverage items, and the keypad does not actually activate any of the dispensing mechanisms. When money, in the form of Japanese yen, is placed into the machine and a 3-digit number is entered on the keypad, however, the machine will output a random item. It's unknown how these items appear, although it won't operate when the door is open or when recording devices are placed inside. The number entered on the keypad has no effect on the item vended, and no pattern has been detected, although the items are always some form of snack food, typically with bright, attention-grabbing packaging. If it's used several times in a short period of time, and/or large amounts of money are entered before an item is vended, the machine will start to dispense bizarre items, with their suitability for human consumption to be often non-existent. The machine can also run with no external power supply, but this leads to vending bizarre items occurring quicker than normal. We're provided a brief list of some of the random items outputted by the machine, starting with a few mundane products such as Coke Zero and Cheetos. There was a can of Pepsi Dragon Twist with a trace of fruit flavor. The flavor was identified as dragon fruit, a product not produced by PepsiCo. Another can of soda was labeled as Dark Side Cola, with clear plastic sides and a clear liquid. When the can was opened, the liquid seemed to react to the air, changing to a dark black color over a period of several seconds. The black colorization was described as looking like billowing smoke, and taste said to be like cola with something spicy in it. The next was a small tube the size of a candy bar made of aluminum with a label reading "The Little Bakery, 7 grain." When the top was twisted off, a massive dough was extruded, although the dough contained several enzymes and bacteria that have not yet been identified. On contact with air, these cause the dough to rise and bake, killing the microbes in the process. The result is a small, round loaf of bread, with the taste described as good but chewy. Another item was a thick plastic baggie with a plastic tube on the side containing water and 12 clams, with a label in Dutch reading "lemon clams." The on-package instructions guided the user to crack the plastic tube like a glow stick, causing liquid in the bag to flash into steam, venting from a hole that popped open in the top of the bag. This ended up burning one researcher, but the steaming finished after 38 seconds, resulting in the clams inside to be fully cooked and infused with a mild lemon flavor. The clams don't seem to match any recorded species. Some of the stranger items vended were labeled in an unknown language and were particularly bizarre. One was a small mesh bag filled with small multicolored pyramids, with the pyramids found to be very hard and unpleasant tasting, compared to chalk in taste and consistency. When placed in hot water, however, the pyramids opened and produced strings that quickly dissolved in the water, coloring it the same shade as the pyramid. The water had no additional taste following this, but testing revealed a sharp increase in mineral, carbohydrate, and protein content, with several unidentified minerals. The content was found to be consistent with the recommended daily intake of nutrients for adult humans, although the researcher that ingested the water reported stomach cramps 2 hours later. Another odd item was an aluminum box with a small glass window on the side and a large round button on the top. The box itself was seamless, filled with small, round animals covered in fur, each with 3 small paws and a single large eye. Pressing the button causes the inside of the box to rapidly become superheated, cooking the small animals alive. Muffled noises and scratching were heard for several seconds, and after 1.5 minutes, the front panel opened, giving access to the now cooked animals. Professor Kane volunteered to eat the animals, describing their taste as crunchy and very spicy, with a small hint of beef. The third unknown item was a tall, thin aluminum can, which caused a chemical reaction when opened. The liquid inside the can was apparently not intended for an oxygenated atmosphere and detonated violently, killing 2 researchers and injuring several others. The testing area was observed to smell like citrus for several days. That's all for the odd vending machine, although there is an extended testing log containing more than 300 further tests, if that interests you. Moving on to something significantly more harmful, SCP-956 is an object resembling a common pinata, constructed of a material superficially similar to paper mache, but actually consists of glue, sugar, unidentified fur, human tissue, and a redacted material. The pinata has proven to be highly resistant to any sort of bludgeoning damage, though the use of gunfire as well as heat and flame have shown to be effective. By default, it remains in a passive state, showing no signs of locomotion or intelligence, and displays no hostility. It enters its active state when a human under the age of 12 comes within 5 meters of it. Shortly after this, the child will become unable to move, holding any stance they had at the time. The victim is incapable of motion or speech, although they remain alive, and their rapidly moving eyes suggest that they retain awareness. The pinata then moves towards the victim and bludgeons them until their torso ruptures, at which point the victim's body discharges a large pile of unmarked candy, ranging from 23 to 1,323 pieces. The pinata will repeat this for any other immobilized victims before returning to a docile state. A victim can be removed from the activation range, which will cause the pinata to return to its passive state, although the victim will not show any signs of recovering from their immobilized state. Autopsies of unbroken victims show that their body had severely dehydrated, leaving them brittle, and that pieces of the candy had begun to grow out of the victim's organs, using the tissue as a component. The amount of this candy produced appears to be directly correlated to time spent in the activation radius. As for the candy, if consumed by someone 12 years or older, they will go into a seizure within 3 minutes, with a 5% possibility of cardiac arrest. There is an approximate 35% chance of survival for such subjects. Children under the age of 12, however, suffer a different effect. First, they will become immobile, followed by experiencing rapid hair loss, a sprouting of paper mache from their skin, and a complete restructuring of bone and muscle. This process takes 9 minutes to complete, at which point they will have transformed into another instance of SCP-956, behaving identically to the original. There is a 0% chance of survival for the victim. At a later point, SCP-956 began to show signs of movement outside of testing, as it began to wander around its containment cell, tracing the perimeter of the room. It did this for about an hour before staring at a spot on the wall, and review of earlier footage showed that it has faced this wall after deactivating during previous tests. Security has confirmed that it is facing directly towards an elementary school, a number of kilometers away, prompting its upgrade to Euclid class. Any SCP that involves children is generally pretty horrific, and that one's no exception, even if it is pretty odd. Moving on to a singular food item, SCP-2107 is a brand of soft drinks known as Diet Ghost, which displays anomalous properties when imbibed. Within 3 to 7 minutes of being consumed, subjects begin to experience paranormal activity equivalent to typical expectations of being haunted by a ghost or other paranormal entity. This effect continues until the liquid is sufficiently broken down into the individual's body, around 1 to 3 hours after ingestion. Research has confirmed that the intensity of the haunting effect, such as the quantity of paranormal entities, the probability of physical harm, and the severity of said harm, is directly proportional to the quantity of the beverage consumed. The cans themselves are the traditional variety used for soft drinks, being uniform in design and non-anomalous in composition and behavior. The can features a light blue background with a Diet Ghost logo, alongside the catchphrase, "Scare your thirst." Most instances also have a sticker on the can with the text, "Made with natural ghosts," printed on it. The cans bear no nutritional information, and the liquid inside is non-anomalous in chemical composition, and within normal parameters for a traditional diet soft drink. They were originally discovered by Foundation personnel at a local supermarket during a routine restocking of a site's recreational facilities. The senior maintenance assistant that was sent on the shopping run was found dead inside of his van, along with 2 empty cans of Diet Ghost. The junior maintenance assistant that was sent with him had gone back inside of the supermarket for only 5 minutes, during which time the senior had drank the 2 cans and died from the paranormal effects. A majority of discoveries have occurred in convenience stores, with some found in supermarkets and restaurants. Employees of retail locations where the cans have been found have professed no prior knowledge to the product's existence, and records of inventory acquisition have shown no references to Diet Ghost. It's so far been recovered from retailers in 37 states and 2 Canadian provinces, with no info about the production and distribution of the product. Of course, we have some testing logs performed on some unfortunate D-Class. The first test was done with 30 milliliters of Diet Ghost, which caused the subject to experience audio-visual phenomena, such as hearing her name spoken softly, seeing shadowy figures at the edges of her vision, and a flickering of the lights within the containment chamber, none of which were corroborated by recorded footage. Afterwards, the subject revealed that they enjoyed the experience overall, describing the taste as bland but refreshing. After a few more trials, the 6th test was done with 90 milliliters, causing the subject to experience intermittent activity for over an hour. They eventually began to experience moderate bleeding from their nose, with no identifiable physical cause, and simultaneously the recording equipment began to encounter interference of a magnetic nature that lasted for 2 minutes. The bleeding continued unabated for several minutes before stopping. The next test was again done with 90 milliliters, which also caused the subject's nose to begin bleeding. After a few minutes of this, the subject began vomiting, although this was evaluated to be purely physiological in nature and non-anomalous. Following this, a majority of the activity ceased, although he reported still having intermittent hallucinations in his peripheral vision for another 20 minutes. The 14th test involved 150 milliliters of Diet Ghost, and caused the subject to experience a number of paranormal effects which rapidly increased in intensity. The lights in the cellar seemed to flicker by both the subject and supervising personnel. The subject reported the feeling of being lifted off the ground, but this is not visible in the footage. The effects began to subside after 54 minutes, stopping entirely a few minutes later. The subject described the taste of the drink as average. Finally, the 31st test involved drinking 270 milliliters of Diet Ghost, which is still not one standard can full. The subject experienced no activity for 31 minutes, at which point all electronics within a 10-meter radius failed for approximately 17 seconds. When power returned, the subject had fallen to the ground unconscious, and the trial was ended. Personnel entered the cell and confirmed the subject had expired. Upon autopsy, their body was found to be void of most major internal organs, with no incision marks or signs of trauma being present. Sometime after testing was concluded, 15 new cans of Diet Ghost were found in a vending machine in one of the site's cafeterias. These cans feature changes to the design of the background, which now features white silhouettes of tombstones, cats, and cartoonish ghosts interspersed between iterations of the logo. Of note is the addition of new stickers to the cans in the same font as the catchphrase text. These stickers include new promotional phrases, including "From the makers of Ghost," 100% more spooky, "Scare-tisfaction guaranteed," and "Your old favorite is back." All of these cans were sent to Site-19 for containment and research trials, and the addition of vending machines to the list of Providence locations is under investigation. Well, I'd hate to see what the non-diet version does. Whether or not a beverage counts as food is certainly debatable, so let's move on to something that's definitely a food item: SCP-3689. 3689 is a sandwich defined by an infohazardous recipe, universally dubbed the Kraken's Belly by those who conceive it. It's a recipe consisting of an abnormal list of ingredients and a detailed, specific method of preparation. Once a person learns the entire process and is able to visualize making the sandwich, they will become subject to its effects. Since it's possible, thanks to human curiosity and imagination, for someone to come up with the full recipe after only learning about as few as 15 of the ingredients and 5 steps of the preparation, we're only given a very partial list. These ingredients include lemon, fresh whale, barbecue sauce, white chocolate chips, imitation crab, any kind of bacteria, gold, and wood shavings from a boat that sailed through a storm. Once someone has visualized creating the entire sandwich, they will begin to experience the sensation of severe hunger and thirst, stomach pains, and lose the ability to taste or smell. They become convinced that the only way to alleviate these symptoms is to prepare the sandwich and eat it. Dangerously high doses of amnestics are required to remove memory of all of the ingredients. Otherwise, subjects will reimagine the sandwich by idly extrapolating. Due to the rarity of several ingredients, however, most attempts to create the sandwich end with the subject either attempting to finish it with substitutes or giving up entirely. If an imperfect sandwich is created and eaten, the symptoms will usually subside over 2 to 4 days. The recipe was originally discovered following the suicide of a disgraced chef during investigation and cataloging of his anomalous possessions. The recipe was fragmented and written into various cookbooks and journals. A D class was allowed to create the sandwich in its entirety and consume it, at which point they stated that there was no extraordinary quality to the sandwich, before disappearing from the room. The room itself then promptly flooded with water, and the D-Class reappeared sometime later, with the room flooding again. They reported having little to no memory of the experience beyond a vague recollection of a ship and captain. Later, another D-Class prepared and consumed the sandwich, with slight difficulty due to the unwieldiness of the squid tentacles, and reported the sandwich to taste okay, but still missing something. The room flooded with seawater, and the D-Class vanished. The body camera footage later recovered showed the D-Class swimming in an ocean before being lifted onto a passing wooden sailing ship and greeted by an indistinct figure dressed as a 16th century pirate. The camera itself was soon after damaged in a sword fight, so the remaining footage was lost. 7 hours after disappearing, the D-Class reappeared inside of a small rowboat filled with gold coins, various fish, an ornate cutlass, and a decorated 3-cornered hat. He reported vague memories of challenging the Kraken alongside the captain, as well as consuming part of said Kraken by adding it to a new 3689 sandwich, which he claims significantly enhanced the flavor. The D-Class additionally requested, and was granted, permission to keep the hat. I suppose I would also like to eat a decent sandwich and then go on an epic pirate adventure with a ship captain taking on a Kraken. Speaking of bread, SCP-2305 is a collection of 5 trees with slices of white bread stapled to them. All attempts to remove the bread from the trees have so far failed. If a particular ritual is performed at these trees, a humanoid composed of bread will appear. This entity will offer parts of itself to eat and will puncture itself to produce wine to drink. This bread and wine have restorative properties, as those who have consumed them report being cured of all physical and mental illnesses. However, anyone who does consume these items will begin to worship the entity, as well as bread in general. While amnestics can successfully erase memories of interaction with the entity, subjects under the effects will still believe in the existence of the entity and will continue to worship bread. Only after the entity is terminated will amnestics become effective at erasing all memories related to it. The ritual to summon bread Jesus requires 50 loaves of white bread, 3.79 liters of red wine, a virgin, 18.14 kilograms of homemade dough, 14.4 cubic centimeters of flour, 3.79 liters of gasoline, matches, and a Bible. The loaves are to be laid between the stapled pieces of bread to form a pentagram, and the wine is to be then poured over all of the loaves. The virgin is placed in the center of the pentagram, and then they are covered in dough so that none of their skin can be seen. This is followed by sprinkling the flour over the virgin as well as the loaves of bread, and then the gasoline is poured, mostly on the virgin and the rest on the 5 pieces of bread. The 5 pieces are then ignited with the matches, followed by igniting the virgin. Finally, Mark 14 verse 22 to 24 is read from the Bible, which reads, "And as they did eat, Jesus took bread, and blessed, and brake it, and gave to them, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said unto them, 'This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many.'" After the dough rises, it will take the form of the entity. It's unknown what happens to the virgin, as all testing indicates that the entity is made entirely of bread and wine. This all came to the Foundation's attention after a series of events that took place in a small town nearby the trees. It began when an unknown group performed the ritual at the trees, leading the manifested entity to an abandoned church near the small town, where he is hidden for the rest of the day. On the second day, a morning mass is held for the residents of the town inside of the church, with 80% of the population being present. Wine and bread from the entity are served, with everyone in attendance consuming part of him. At the end of the sermon, the entity introduces himself, and everyone in attendance acknowledges him as the personification of a deity. A banquet is then held, using more bread and wine from the entity. On the third day, he visits the rest of the town, with those who appear to be afraid of him being reprimanded, despite the entity not wishing for this to happen. He feeds part of himself to one civilian afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, with the man claiming that a miracle occurred, as he can now remember his past clearly. Over the course of the following 4 days, those who refuse to consume part of the entity are discriminated against by approximately 40% of his worshippers. These individuals are often refused service from businesses in town and are called gluten-free. The entity himself is unaware of the abusive treatment, and every night offers parts of himself for consumption. It's estimated that 90% of the town have consumed part of him by day 7. On day 8, a man named Joseph Westing, who was responsible for starting the gluten-free slur, announces the creation of the Westing Church of Wonder Bread. The tenets of this denomination are similar to those advocated by the entity, but they believe that white bread is the superior bread. 40% of the town join the denomination. Over the next few days, members of the Westing Church of Wonder Bread become increasingly hostile toward the gluten-free civilians, forcing one family out of the town entirely. The family's accounts are the first that the Foundation hears of the incident, and an MTF is sent to investigate. On day 12, members of the Wonder Bread Church attack a bakery, resulting in 2 civilians being stabbed to death with sharpened, stale baguettes, and 4 being beaten with the same weapons. The entity publicly denounces the Westing Church of Wonder Bread as the MTF arrives and detains the entity. The following day, the MTF begin administering amnestics to the town, causing the Church of Wonder Bread to riot. 4 Foundation employees and 20 civilians are injured in the ensuing chaos. Afterwards, Class B amnestics are successfully administered to the rest of the population, and the entity is transferred to a Foundation site for containment. The next day, the residents return to worshipping bread and referencing the entity. The individuals responsible for the Westing Church of Wonder Bread create another organization called the King's Hawaiian Congregation. When asked about this, the entity replied that they can still feel his presence, so they still know. Although, what more is faith than a feeling? The doctor in charge of the entity requests its termination, which is approved by the site director. The entity does not resist during the process, and is terminated via incineration. The day after, the MTF airdrops a gaseous amnestic onto the town, followed by administering amnestics to any that didn't encounter the gas. All memories of the entity are erased, and all evidence that the trees and the ritual exist is confiscated. Before he was terminated, the entity was interviewed at the site, stating that there is nothing for him to hide. He says that he comes from the Great Bakery, and has returned to once again enlighten men and women in the ways of the baker, and to let them feast upon his body. When asked when he was last here, the entity says that he doesn't know the passage of time, but he can say for certain that massive bounds in culture and technology have taken place. During his last appearance, he attempted to do the same as he did here, bringing bread and urging people to break it with one another. The only difference was that back then, bread and wine were scarce, so he was considered a blessing and a miracle. The doctor asks if he doesn't consider himself those things, to which the entity replies that he is just a humble butter knife, spreading the words of the baker. He's asked if he feels pain when he tears off pieces of himself, to which he says that he does, but he's grown used to it. He has suffered for the masses in other terrible ways. Giving away his blood and flesh to feed the hungry is but a prick in comparison. He then offers a small piece of bread from his arm to the doctor, who says that he just ate. The doctor then asks him if he's aware of the actions of the Church of Wonder Bread, as they attacked a bakery for selling, in their words, whole grain, the heathen's bread. The entity says that he knows of this, and he should have spoken with them, as he does not condone their message. Wonder Bread is terribly bland, and he much prefers Pepperidge Farm. Overall, Bread Jesus seems like a decent guy, and the fact that his parts can heal any condition is pretty incredible, but I'd feel better about him if it didn't require actual blood sacrifice to summon him. Let's finish with a classic SCP, SCP-1689. 1689 is a burlap bag of potatoes, which in its stable state weighs between 40 and 50 kilograms and contains approximately 200 common potatoes. The interior of the bag, however, is vastly larger than its exterior, with the interior space measured to be at least 10,000 cubic meters, but is believed to be much greater than this. The interior is completely filled with a seemingly endless amount of potatoes. The bag was originally recovered from a small village of around 200 people in northern Siberia. A Russian official reported that the village had made no outside contact in 4 decades and had no surrounding farmland. The Foundation investigated the reports, discovering that the village had been using the bag as its sole food source for well over a century. As a result, the villagers were suffering from extreme calcium and iron deficiencies, with none of them able to recall how they had come into possession of the bag, only that it had been there since before the Reds, and that it was a gift for working hard. So far, there has only been one fully equipped expedition into the bag, and of course we have an expedition log. The mission was led by Captain Wells, who kept a journal of the events. I would normally read this in its entirety, but due to the extensive amount of profanity in it, I think it's best to paraphrase. 6 days before the mission's start, Wells is informed of the assignment, and he writes that he and 3 others are going to head into a sack of potatoes. At this point, nothing surprises him. He writes that since this is an official log, he could refer to his fellow agents Frederick, Carlin, and Xander by their last names, but since no one checks these, he won't. The day before the mission start, the team is given their equipment for the expedition. They're given a new liquid substance to use, which is some kind of acid or enzyme that dissolves the potatoes into a starchy paste. It mostly drains away, but then some of it sort of hardens to make a nice tunnel ceiling. Wells writes that it's actually scary how fast it works, and they'll have to wear skin protection so it doesn't get on them. With spray nozzles, they can carve their way straight into potatoes. Finally, the mission starts, and the team enters into the bag, coming out into a small room made out of plywood that the researchers had already cleared out for them. After opening up the door to the room, they are greeted by a wall of potatoes, above, in front, and below them. They decide to cut a roughly 2 by 2 meter tunnel straight forward, using radio signals to find their way back to the entrance. The following day, they continue excavating, clearing out about 30 meters of potato an hour. That's a kilometer in 2 days if they make good effort, and it isn't that hard of work, as 2 of them spray and the other 2 shovel away the goop. Every 100 meters or so, they put up some support beams. It's not pleasant though, and by day 2, Wells complains about the stench caused by the enzyme, which makes everything smell like vomit. A few days go by, and on the 5th day, Wells writes that they accidentally spilled some enzyme onto the ground potatoes, revealing a concrete floor underneath. This is the first thing other than potatoes they've found, so they decide to just continue on from the floor, since it's nice to have solid footing. On day 8, Wells writes that the word spud comes from digging with a spade to make the hole you plant them in. Carlin apparently made sure the rest of the team knew this, and then she repeated the word spud to herself all day while they were excavating. On day 9, he writes that this is hardly even agent work, so why don't they have D-Class doing this? By day 11, it's become too inefficient to resupply the team every few days, so Command is providing them with 2 months of MREs and more than enough enzyme to last that long. If they don't find anything by that point, then the mission will be abandoned. They'll still be in radio contact, however. The following day, Wells writes that it's nice being alone with the team, and at night it's almost like camping. Camping in a weird cavern made of spuds. On day 16, they find a wall made of concrete, running at an angle 20 degrees to their tunnel's perpendicular. Command tells them to follow it, as it's not like there's anything else interesting going on. A few more days pass by, and they decide that since there's a concrete floor and walls, there might be a ceiling. Sure enough, there is, 3 meters above them, which means that this whole time, they've been inside of a huge building. If they can map it out, they can probably find an exit and discover where in the world this potato hell is. 9 days later, Wells just writes that Xander pronounces it as potato, and somehow he went 4 weeks without saying the word. He's the first person that Wells has met that says it like that. On day 36, Wells writes that they've now been following the wall longer than they haven't, and Xander thinks that it isn't going anywhere, but Frederick wants to press on. Command deferred to Wells, and since he doesn't want the last month to have been pointless, they'll go for another 3 kilometers at least. 2 days later, they decide to instead blow a hole in the wall. For some reason, Carlin had charges in her pack, so they figured they might as well. They all stood clear and blasted, and after taking quite a while to clear out the resulting mashed potatoes, they found a 3-meter hole in the wall. On the other side, however, were more potatoes. They spent a day excavating through the hole they made, and they discover that it actually is different on the other side, which they determined to be outside. The ground is dirt and extremely dead grass instead of concrete, with Wells guessing that the building was some kind of gigantic warehouse. They've been hearing these sort of faint rumbles ever since they blew the charges, with Xander starting to get spooked about it. On day 43, Wells writes that they've continued to dig upwards to try and get out of the potatoes, but so far they've had no luck. He wonders if it goes all the way up into the atmosphere, or if the entire universe is filled with potatoes. It's weird for him to think that they're outside, but technically they're underground. It's just that the ground is made of potatoes. The following day, however, they find an actual tree. It's dead and surrounded by potatoes, but it's a tree rooted in the ground nonetheless. They had to be careful clearing around it, since the enzyme will chew through it, but they managed to uncover it. Its branches were sort of weird, splitting at these perfect 30-degree angles, but overall it looked pretty normal. They took a bark sample, but it's clear now that they're outside, which makes the identity of this place quite peculiar. On day 48, Xander became worried enough about the rumbling sound that he went back to investigate, finding that about 100 meters of their tunnel caved in. Command didn't know that this happened either, but they're going to start digging them out from the other side. They left it in Wells' hands if he wanted to continue excavating. Frederick and Carlin want to continue, so they do so, dealing with Xander's complaining. By day 51, they continue to find more odd things, with Frederick uncovering a twisted bicycle. Wells had known there had to be humans here before because of the building, but it didn't really occur to him until he saw that bicycle. On day 55, Wells laments that he's an awful captain, as there was another huge cave-in that nearly crushed them all. They somehow managed to take safe refuge under the tree branches, but they lost contact with command in the process, and can still detect some faint radio transmissions, but it's too staticky for correspondence. They've now decided to turn back, but it could take weeks now to get out. A week later, Frederick says that they should have brought an Irishman, and despite Wells insulting him, he spent the rest of the day chuckling about it. On day 65, they run out of food rations. Xander began freaking out, saying that they were going to starve, until Wells told him he was an idiot. A couple of days later, however, Wells complains that they should have brought a spice kit, as his taste buds are going to shut down from all of this. Carlin had cooking equipment in her pack for some reason, so they can prepare the potatoes in a couple of different ways, but they're still just potatoes. It's too difficult for them to clear out the original tunnels they made, so Wells plans on just telling the team to start carving a new tunnel straight back to the entrance. On day 69, however, they run out of enzyme, as they can't really ration it. The good news is that they made it back inside of the building when they ran out, so they can use their shovels to make a more narrow tunnel near the ceiling. The real problem is dealing with space, as they have to physically move the potatoes now and dump them somewhere. The best they can do is dump them 5 meters behind them, so they have a little bubble of space that they can move through the building. It's going to take a long time, but their food is covered, and the potatoes actually have enough water in them. The oxygen is starting to get stale, however, as Wells doesn't know how much is able to fit in the cracks between the potatoes. This was supposed to be a 65-day mission max, and despite the fact that Command is digging from the other side, the team is getting depressed. Wells writes that Frederick made a joke about the word tuber, and although he doesn't remember what it was, he knows it was stupid. On day 70, Wells writes that they now notice something new about the potatoes, commenting on how ugly they are. They've got bulges which sort of wiggle and grow slowly. Since they're eating these things, he remarks on how absolutely disgusting it is. He later writes on how much he hates the smell of potatoes, and he'd rather have the vomit smell back. On day 72, they realize that their small bubble of space has actually grown smaller because of more potatoes. Their area wasn't precisely dimensioned, but after Carlin mentioned it, it became obvious to everyone that the area has shrunk. The following day, Wells paid attention to the bulges, noting that they actually get big pretty fast, and when they get to be the size of a potato, they split off. So that's where all the potatoes are coming from. Day 74, Wells writes that they're running out of space and time. There's barely enough room to work anymore, and they're knocking elbows and shoulders while they shovel. He repeatedly swears about potatoes and tubers, writing that they'll kill him while he's sleeping and he'll have a potato stuffed down his throat. On day 75, Wells vents in his log about Xander's constant complaining and how they all hate the darkness and the yellow lamps and the brown potatoes and the tasteless food. He can't yell at his team as he keeps them all going. He's the captain, the potato commander, so he just vents it all in these logs. The next day he just writes that he can't breathe and there's no room to shovel. On day 78, he writes that he feels like he's breathing inside someone else's lungs, who's already exhaled, so there's nothing but carbon dioxide. No one can even speak while they're working. They'll be dead within the week. Death by potatoes. Despite this, nearly 3 months after the start of the expedition, the 4 agents are found by the secondary excavation team. Although all of the team were suffering from oxygen deficiency and in a deteriorated mental state, all of them fully recovered within 3 weeks. Captain Wells declined to write a post-mission summary. Another fantastical part of the SCP universe. It's wild to think that somewhere out there is an alternate universe where some anomalous potatoes began multiplying and then continued to multiply and multiply, potentially filling the entire universe in endless potatoes. Fortunately, the effect doesn't seem to be spreading outside of the burlap bag, or the Foundation would have quite the situation on their hands. As mentioned, this was just a small handful of the large amount of anomalies related to food in some way, and was mostly just an excuse for me to discuss a bunch of smaller SCPs.